to our final speaker of today. I'm very excited to announce Rachel Andrew is with us because Rachel has actually flown in all the way from Boston, especially for today, although Rachel is actually from Bristol. So this is great for us. Rachel is a web developer with Perch and is going to speak about grids all the way down.
Okay, hello. It's really nice to be here. Yes, I did come from Boston. That's where I was speaking at event apart. And so I'm kind of stopping off here on the way back to Bristol. You are nowhere near Heathrow Airport. So I have been doing stuff on the web since about 1996, which makes me very old. Right now I am, as mentioned, co-founder of Perch CMS, also Noticed, as some of the other speakers have been sharing their slides on Noticed. I'm editor-in-chief of Smashing Magazine. We're always looking for writers. You can always send me an outline. I'd love that. I write technical docs for MDN, and I'm a member of the CSS working group. I was an invited expert. I'm now the official representative for Frontiers, who are a Dutch organisation of web developers, and they have sort of decided to become a member of the W3C and have me as their rep, which also means that I'm somewhat funded for some of my standards work, which is wonderful after having this rather expensive hobby of contributing to the web platform for so many years. When I'm not sort of doing web stuff, usually out for a long run or flying small airplanes in the company of my long-suffering flying instructor. So I can talk about all of those things, but while I'm up here, I'm going to talk about CSS and CSS Layout in particular, because that's my very favourite thing to talk about. And I'm going to show you some things that exist, some things that kind of almost exist, we're getting there with, and some things that, you know, maybe we're not quite going to have yet, but are really interesting. So CSS Grid Layout. I've actually been talking about Grid Layout since about 2011. It didn't get into browsers until 2017. I was quite glad when it got into browsers because it was starting to feel like CSS vaporware, which, you know, isn't great. So we got that into browsers, and people are starting to use it. People are using it on production sites. There's some very big sites that are using Grid Layout. But I'm still hearing this kind of thing. People tell me things like this on Twitter. I'm not quite sure why. You know, I can use Flexbox for everything, so why on earth should I use Grid? People never ask me whether they should use colour or fonts in their web design. But they do like to say, you know, assume these things are two completely separate things. You know, should I be using Flexbox or should I use Grid? And like, you don't even know when you start building a website which thing you might need to use to build it. And I think it really is time to stop thinking about these things as separate layout methods, because we're not picking between Bootstrap and Foundation. You should use the layout method that suits the pattern that you're trying to create. The fact these things are different specifications really doesn't matter. That's CSS working group process. We have things as separate specifications because it means that we can get the things finished and shipped into browsers and say this thing is done. But they're all CSS. They're all actually just a value of the display property. So we're just using CSS. And you know, originally when Flexbox was shipped first and then Grid came a bit later, but at this point there's not a whole lot of difference in terms of browser support. Yes, older versions of IE do have Flexbox support, but it's pretty buggy. You're going to have to do quite a lot of working around that anyway. So you may as well use the modern CSS that makes sense and then figure out how to do fallbacks. And there's lots of ways that you can do fallbacks for both. And typically what you find is once you kind of understand what these two layout methods do, look at the pattern that you need to build, because most of the time it will tell you which layout method you need to use. So maybe you've got like a bunch of stuff, and that stuff all has different sizes. It's different lengths. You just want it displayed in a readable way. You'd like the browser to lay this stuff out in a kind of sensible manner, not sort of stick a great big thing into a tiny column or then leave loads of space around a tiny thing. Now that is a really good job for Flexbox. That's not a grid. It's just a bunch of stuff laid out in a reasonable way for that stuff. And that's what Flexbox is really good for, because that's what we designed it for. We designed it for taking a bunch of stuff and laying it out in a readable way. It's really good at this kind of squishy sizing, which is why it's called Flexbox, Flexible Box Layout Model. It's for laying out these things that are all different sizes and just kind of doing so in a good way. Now grid is different. And again, in the name, it's for creating a grid. Now grids have strict rows and columns. So then you have this set structure in mind. You know how big these columns and rows really need to be. You know maybe how many there are. You want things to line up both across the rows and down the columns. And well, that's a grid. And the fact that you can do this sort of thing with Flexbox by adding widths to everything, that's really not the point. If you're trying to make Flexbox into a grid layout, then you probably should have just used grid in the first place, and you're actually going to make your job an awful lot harder by trying to use Flexbox. And just because you're placing items into a grid doesn't mean that an item can't affect the sizing of the grid. You know, we've got all sorts of ways for items, for us to look at the size of the items and make the grid respond to that. But because it's a grid, if one item makes a column track bigger, that's going to happen all the way up the column because it's a grid. It's not going to make one thing bigger and everything else stay the same size. And really, when you don't want to use Flexbox, if you find that you're creating a pattern and you're putting widths on absolutely everything to make them line up with stuff above and below as well as along the row, if you're doing that, that's a pretty good sign that you're using the wrong layout method. If you're putting widths on everything in Flexbox, you probably want to be using grid. You will have an awful lot less code. It will be easier for you to do. So we can have a look at that sort of thing. This is a common pattern. We've got a set of cards, and they're laying out just using Flexbox. Now there we've just got 3 cards, so they lay out just in one row really nicely. Now maybe I'll add some more cards to my layout. And then we end up with something like this. So I've now got 5 cards. I've got 3 on the top line, they've wrapped. I've then got 2 on the bottom. And because it's Flexbox, and because those things can grow and shrink, on the second row, we've only got 2 cards, so they each get more space. And so they sort of split the difference and share out the space. The last line of cards, they don't line up with the cards above. And if you're thinking, well, actually, I would like those to line up, I'd like cards 4 and 5 to line up underneath card 1 and 2, well, then that's where you'd really want to be using grid, because you want those things lined up in a grid. I'm going to take this out of my pocket and see if that stops it from making that noise. Ooh, I think I've just pulled the thing off. Well, the noise is gone, but you might not be able to hear me. Don't know. Right, let's put that there, and I will try not to throw it on the floor. So that'll be the next thing. Now it's tethered to me. Right. So if you have the mindset that you can only use Flexbox because you've set off down this road of using Flexbox, then you might start to constrain the Flex layout to make it more grid-like. But if you see these things as interchangeable, it's just a choice you can make. You know, do I use Flexbox or grid? Oh, maybe I'll switch between them. Then you can just try out the other layout method. So a couple of lines and a flex layout becomes a grid layout. So we've got a flex layout there on the left to display flex, and flex wrap wraps, the things will wrap. And then we're making the size of the items. The flex spaces are 400 pixels, but they can grow and they can shrink. If we go and look at it in grid, we do everything on the parent element. So there I'm using repeat autofill and min-max to create the same kind of layout with grid, except that in grid, we get this effect, which is what we wanted. We wanted the things to line up in both rows and columns. That's a grid, so we use grid layout. And that's what we mean when people say, oh, grid is 2-dimensional, flex is 1-dimensional. 1-dimensional means I'm going to line things up as a row or as a column, but not both at the same time. Whereas grid is 2-dimensional. It works the same in both axes. You're lining things up in rows and in columns at the same time. But also, grid works exactly the same in both dimensions. And we don't always see this immediately for a simple reason. On the web, block elements expand in the inline dimension to take up space. You know, if you've got a div on a page, it's going to stretch out as wide as it can and take up all the space in the inline direction. But what they don't do is expand in the block dimension. So if you put a div on the page, it doesn't get as tall as the viewport, for example, by default. That's not how things work. So you often don't have extra space in the block dimension to kind of see how things work. But if you do give the block dimension a length, then grid will stretch and fill that container, just exactly the same way as it does in the inline direction. So you can play with the block dimension in grid, you can play with height, and you can do that, and you can kind of keep everything aligned. And I don't think that we play with block dimensional alignment as much as we could on the web and in web design, because typically that's been very, very hard to do with the kind of layout methods of the past. But now that we've got things like grid, I think we can start to play a bit more with height and the height of the viewport and the height of all the content and how we lay things out. So being able to use white space above things without floated elements popping up and going and sitting in it. Now another reason you might use grid, if we sort of step away from just the sort of 1 or 2 dimensions, there's a few other things that you might want to do. If you've got layouts that are, for some reason, restricted in the block dimension, for instance, you want to have what look like fixed height rows of content. You sometimes see this, you'll sort of see designs that have very, very neat little blocks of content, sometimes used for navigation and things. The problem is that every time we fix the height of something on the web, we risk having overflow. Because if you get more content into one of your boxes and you fix the height of that box, there's nowhere for it to go and it's just going to overflow messily. And you see this every now and again. You know, someone has done this, they've fixed the height of boxes, they've kind of forgotten that on the web people are going to come along and either change their font size or they're going to come along with the CMS and go, oh, we need to have a really, really long headline in this box. And then it's all going to break out and go everywhere. And I've got a CMS product. We still get people coming into our forum saying, how do we restrict the amount of content that gets into the text fields because it's breaking my layout? Now, you should never really end up with that situation. But the nice thing with grid is that it gives you ways to make it look like you've got these really fixed height boxes of content that still cope if more content gets in or the content is bigger than we expected. And that's to use min-max. We've got this min-max function for track sizing. So you can create this effect. You can say, I want my tracks to be a minimum of 100 pixels tall, but the maximum is auto. Now, auto is kind of a bit special when it comes to track sizing, but generally it means as big as is needed for the content. So rows are auto-sized by default, which means that, you know, as content goes in, they just grow, so they become as tall as the biggest content in that row. So if something's got a maximum of auto, the maximum is, well, just get as big as you need to be. So our boxes are going to be fixed height in most scenarios when the content is ideal, but if some extra content gets in or the content is bigger, they will be able to grow in the block dimension to take that content. And really, all this is to say, you've just got a lot more choice now when doing layout. You know, take advantage of them. The reason I'm starting with this kind of Flexbox versus grid thing is that there's very rarely a right or wrong way to use web platform features when it comes to things like CSS. I mean, really, the only things you need to worry about are those things that cause a problem with accessibility. So things like reordering content, you need to be a little bit careful of. But if you're not doing that, you know, the choice between using Flexbox or grid, that's not going to hurt anyone. It's not going to be a problem. And the CSS working group do not come round with a big stick to tell you off if you use the wrong one. Just try the things that are out there and see which works best for your patterns. So those are just some of the sort of neat things that we have with grid. These are little things that make me happy because they are solving problems that I have had throughout my 20-year career as a web developer. And that's really the very cool thing about being part of the CSS working group. I can say, I know that web developers have these problems because I have had these problems. You know, can we fix that? How are we going to do that? And a lot of what I do when I'm going around talking to people is finding the problems so I can take them back to the people who make CSS and see if we can get them sorted out. So, you know, we run into new problems. And I think that as we got grid, essentially we've pushed some problems a layer deeper. And so I'm kind of interested in that. If we look at these airplane cards again, these are all excellent airplanes. These are some of my favourites. I really like aeroplanes, which is fortunate because I spent an awful lot of time in the back of them. So we've got two cards displayed next to each other, and they've got different amounts of text in the captions. And the captions don't line up. Now, that might be fine, but if you've got a really neat set of cards, maybe you've got, you know, a bunch of products or what have you, and they sort of, you know, you'd like to have everything lined up. You'd like the sort of headers and footers of the cards to line up neatly across the grid. And that's kind of tricky to do. Because my cards are a figure inside an LI. So we've got a bunch of structured content here, structured data. We've used the right semantic HTML for it. The LI is a direct child of the grid, so it participates in the grid layout because only things that are a direct child of the grid container become grid items, same with Flexbox. So the figure is like an independent little grid inside an existing grid layout. And it's got 2 columns, it's got 2 rows. I'm using min-max to stop the caption area vanishing if there's no content, giving it a max of auto. But it doesn't know anything about the sizing of the other cards. Because it's sort of its own little nested grid, it doesn't know that the card to the right has got a taller caption. It doesn't know anything about that, so it can't react to that and get bigger. So, it would be nice if we could kind of lay things out that are deep nested inside the grid. It would be nice if we could also lay those things out on the grid. So to understand the problem, CSS has this concept of normal flow, or block and inline layout. It's pretty much the first thing you learn. You start to learn CSS, and you're told, well, some things are block and they kind of expand, they go onto a new line. Some things are inline, like the word in a sentence, or a span, or a link, and those things stay sort of inline in the sentence. Now, CSS will always try and go back to this normal flow. So if you do something with the display property, you change the value of display, you change how a container behaves, you're going to change how it behaves, how its children behave, but inside that, CSS is right, I'm going back to normal flow. Because if it didn't, you'd have to lay out absolutely everything on your page. So this is quite useful. It means we can kind of start to tweak layout from a container in, but we're only ever kind of changing a level of layout. Layout doesn't inherit in the way that fonts do and so on, because that would be terrible if you think about it for a while. So here's a simple sort of example. I'm using Flexbox here, so I've got a normal flow heading, I've then got a paragraph, then I've got a box which is set to display flex, so the image and the content are flex items, but inside the flex item, we've got the title, media object, and then some content. That's just gone back to normal flow, because we're inside that flex item. We don't end up sort of being flex items all the way down. So my captions don't participate in the parent grid layout, and so they can't be placed on the tracks defined on the parent grid. Let's say it's, that's generally useful, it's generally what you'd expect. But then when you're working in grid, quite often what you really want to be able to do is just define a big grid and say, right, okay, so you're nested 3 levels deep, but I'd still like you to sit on this 12-column grid I've created. That's a sort of a reasonable request. But say that's why it's difficult, because we don't behave like that in layout in CSS. So the only way to sort of do that at the moment would be to start flattening out the markup. I'd have to pull the cards out of the list. I'd have to take them out of the figures. I'd need to make everything a direct child of the grid container. And in fact, to maintain auto placement, to maintain the ability for the thing just have as many cards as I want and then just be laid out, I actually had to break the source order, which you don't ever want to do because that makes it completely inaccessible and a mess for anyone tabbing around it. So we ended up with 2 planes and then the captions, and that's really all not very good. So we can't do a lot of sort of design features that look like this very easily. And the fact that we needed to rearrange the items, that also means that something that we have got in CSS, the display contents, the value of contents for display, that's not going to help us either. And there's sometimes a bit of confusion between display contents and the features that I'm going to talk about, Subgrid. So I wanted to sort of mention display contents because it's pretty useful, but it's not for this particular case. So display contents, that is potentially useful if you've got items that you want to participate in a flex or a grid layout, but they have some markup around them which is semantically important. So, for instance, the UL of a list, you don't want to take away that UL, that's what makes a list, but you might not want the kind of box of the UL displayed visually or actually there in the markup at all. So that's what I've got here. I've got a little layout here which has some direct children and then also a list which is sort of got some list items there, and so there's the markup. So the divs are direct children, the UL is a direct child, and the final div is a direct child. So that lays out like this. The LIs, though, they're just displaying as normal list items, and they've got a pink background. So here's some CSS. There's my display grid, grid template columns, 3 1FR columns. The direct children of grid have a background colour, that's that sort of transparent background colour, and the list items have the pink. If we go to our UL and say display contents, what essentially happens is that the box of the UL is removed, as if it was never there at all. It's been removed by CSS from the display. It's a bit like saying display none, except if you said display none, the entire list and all the child elements would vanish. It would be like that was never there at all. Display content is the same kind of thing. It's one of the box generation values, but it just removes the actual box itself, not the children of the box. That is really, really useful if you have semantic markup that you do not want to be sort of part of the layout, because you want the children to lay out, in this case, on the grid layout. What you will notice, they haven't been promoted to direct children. They've still got their pink background colour, so they're not being picked up by the universal selector for direct children. They're not direct children. We've just removed visually that box. Anything else set on the box, so say font sizing or anything like that, that will still apply. It's just the things that sort of happen to the box that go away. So that's your borders, margins, padding, width and height, and so on. Now, that's really brilliant. It's got reasonable browser support at this point, except it's got an enormous bug. For some reason, although it does say very clearly in the display specification that it shouldn't be the case, when you use display contents at the moment, I think Firefox have now fixed this mostly, but what is happening is the element has been removed from the accessibility tree, which means that if you use it for, say, something with some structure like a UL, because it's been removed from the accessibility tree, the screen reader does not know that that's a list anymore. This is wrong. Display none is supposed to be interpreted by screen readers and so on, and actually if you say display none on something, screen readers will also skip it, so that would be like taken away. Display content is supposed to be only a visual thing. It shouldn't have any effect on anything else. Unfortunately, at the moment it does. You need to be really, really careful when using it and test in assistive technology. This is a really useful URL, just explains the problem and also points to the browser bugs on the different browser bug trackers, so you can follow along and see when that's been fixed. And I believe that Can I Use also showed this has been partially implemented to kind of reflect the seriousness of this bug. So moving away from display contents, which I say very useful for that specific use case, but not quite the same thing that we're talking about. We've got this value for grid template columns and grid template rows, which is subgrid. Now this is going to let us kind of get around this issue of, oh, only direct children can use the grid layout. So you can already nest grids, as it were. A grid item can be made into a grid. So you can have display grids all the way down if you like. That's fine, and they can have their own independent column and row tracks. That's already absolutely fine. You know, grid items can become grid containers. They could also become flex containers. You can keep on changing the value of display as far down as you want. That's fine. But as I say, you can't get things to then line up that are in nested grids with other things. So what I've got here is some CSS. It's defining the outer grid, and that's got the white border. There's an item that sits on that grid. That item is also a grid, and it's got a sub-item sitting on it. So that's what we can see there. With the Firefox Grid Inspector, this is the outer grid on the parent with the white border. If you're doing any grid layout stuff and you're not using Firefox, you really should be, because the Grid Inspector is fantastic. And you get this really nice sort of layout of your grid, so you can actually see what you're doing with it. So that's the inner grid selected. So I've defined some fixed height rows. So this grid doesn't quite fill the container. And that's there with them both. Fairly new feature of the Grid Inspector. You can have multiple grids highlighted, so you can kind of see where they are, and that the lines don't actually line up with each other inside there. There's no relationship between the lines of the parent and child grids. We just started over with a new grid. So subgrid will basically let us selectively opt grids on grid items into the grid layout. So in this example, we could create a subgrid for columns by not defining columns, but saying grid template columns, subgrid. So now the child, however many tracks it spans by column, it's going to use them as its grid tracks. So if it's here we're spanning 5 tracks, so now it's a 5-track grid with the same sizing as the parent. So then when we're placing the item, we number according to the track numbers on the subgrid. You don't have to figure out where it is on the parent. Your line numbers still start from 1 in the subgrid, it's just that your track sizing is coming from the parent grid. We could create a subgrid just on rows. So I've still got my 3 1FR columns, so they don't line up with the parent because I'm only doing rows. But this time I've got 2 row tracks because my item spans over 2 row tracks on the parent. And so we're just going to use those tracks now. We could also create a subgrid in both dimensions. Now that ties the dimensions of our item completely to the parent, and the number of grid cells in the item are now controlled entirely by the parent. We're not going to be able to create any new rows in there if we have extra content, so you need to be aware of that. So if you've got a subgrid in both dimensions, it's completely tied to the tracks that the parent has. So a few little bits and pieces about subgrids. They say line numbers start from 1 inside the subgrid, exactly the same as they do with a normal grid. And it would be very confusing if they didn't, because you'd have to be always knowing exactly where it was on the parent to be able to place things. So you can see there the line 1 on the subgrid is actually on line 2 of the parent. So everything inside the component is just referring to its own subgrid. What you can do, though, is you can specify line names on your parent, and those are passed into the subgrid. If you want to use named lines, they will actually be passed through. So you can sort of set call start on the parent, it's going to get passed in, which is what I'm doing in this bit of code here. So you name the lines in square brackets as normal on the parent, and then inside the subgrid we can sort of position our item. Rather than using the numbers, we can use those line names. They're just passed straight through. If you've got a line, you can use those names all the way down. You can also add named lines to the subgrid itself. So if you're building a little component and you want that component to have named lines, you can specifically add those actually to the subgrid, and they'll just be added to the lines that are inherited in. In grid, it's quite possible to have an awful lot of lines for any one item. You can then use whichever of those lines you like to position it. It really doesn't matter. So you can add some extra lines. So we can do something like this. And you can see there where I've got my subgrid keyword, I've then got my named lines. Basically, a name for each line in square brackets after the keywords, because we don't actually have any tracks to place the line names in between when we're dealing with a subgrid. So we just sort of whack them on the end there in order that you want. Subgrids will inherit the gap you have set on the parent. So if you have said column gap, row gap, or gap, that will just be passed through to the subgrid. So it will, just carry on using any gaps that you have already set. But you can change them, because sometimes you might not want to have any gaps on your subgridded item. You might want those things to ignore the gap completely. So you can change that just by using the gap properties on your subgrid. And you can see here, when you have a sort of a grid line, it essentially goes down the middle of a gap. So if you, say, set your row gap, as I have here, to 0, it's almost as if you've kind of added a negative margin to the outer edge of the subgridded item. So it will kind of eat into the gap. So it looks like then there's no gap there. It's also obviously worth noting that sizing of items in the subgrid can change the size of the parent track. If you put something bigger in the subgridded item and the track can grow, it's going to affect all the way along the row, even kind of outside of the subgridded item. And so if we go back to the airplane cards example, that's how we would get our captions to line up across the grid. We'd need to create a subgrid for grid template rows, make the card span 2 rows of the subgrid. The parent grid has a gap, which I don't want in the card, so I set that to 0, and the captions will then all line up with each other because they're in the same row of the grid. That's really neat. here's the bad news. There's currently no browser implementations of Subgrid. The specs at a point we, hope we would get that. Really, we're going to be looking at Chromium, WebKit, or Firefox. At the moment, yep, it looks a bit like this. But I have slightly better news, because when I first gave this presentation a month ago, I had to mock up all of those examples using browser dev tools. What I've shown you are actually all live screenshots out of a pre-release version of Firefox Nightly, which has been shared with me so that I can find bugs and things. And so Firefox are actually implementing Subgrid, and it kind of works. All of those things worked pretty well in Firefox. So that's pretty cool. Firefox are actually implementing. We're going to get something that we can really play around with. But having it just in Firefox is probably not that useful to all of us. And this is really a bit of a problem, and kind of comes to something that really I want to talk about a little bit, because I think it's quite important. We got a version of Grid at all. Back in this, the reason I've been talking about Grid since 2011 is because Grid was originally implemented by the Microsoft team in IE10 prefixed. Now, that implementation was pivotal in allowing people like me to play around with it and evangelize the spec, and to make sure that we actually did get it in browsers. And I think the fact that Grid came from IE in the first place highlights this problem of a world where we are losing independent rendering engines. Edge is going Chromium very soon, so we lose one of the rendering engines from the web. And I think the fact that we are losing places where things can be developed makes it even more important that we, as a web development community, and the people who use this stuff, use our influence on the browsers that are left. And we do have influence. Web developers, regular people who build websites, have influence over what ends up in our browsers and the CSS that gets made at all. And so how do we actually sort of tell browsers what we want to have in the platform? I mean, to start with, we can literally just go and show our support. If we find the issue raised for implementation of a feature in the browser, we can star it, we can follow it. If we've got a kind of new use case, we've got something that's not listed there that we're trying to do that would be solved by that feature, we can even add a comment. So this is the bug for Chromium. And I've made it nice and easy. That's a QR code. You can go to that, or you can go to my slides later and go to that, and you can star that bug. And the nice thing as well, if you star or you follow a browser bug, then you'll get updates when it's updated, so you'll get to know if something's happening with that feature. So, go and find that and maybe add your vote. We'd like to see more people adding votes for implementing Subgrid in Chromium. Here's the bug for Firefox. Say Firefox are already on track with this, but you can always go and follow that bug in order to sort of see what's happening. Firefox and most of the browsers, they'll have a sort of meta bug, which is kind of like implement this, and then there'll be lots of little sub-bugs, which are all the different parts of implementing that. If you find the sort of main one, that's usually a good one to follow if you want to see what activity, and also just to show your support. Now, Edge are moving to Chromium, but the Edge engineers are still working on the browser. They're going to be committing things to Chromium. And I don't know what influence they'll have, but they've still got their user voice up. So that's another place you can go and say, hey, I'd like to have a Subgrid. I recommend that you do that. That would be really helpful. If you think you could use this stuff, do show your support. People are often very, very surprised about how small the teams are that implement this stuff in browsers. And browsers are just businesses. And like any business, you want to implement a feature in your product. And you're just an engineer, you work on that thing, you think, oh, it'd be really good. Our users would love this feature, I'd love to implement it. But you've got to convince your boss. You've got to get your boss to say, okay, we'll put resources into implementing this feature. Now, browsers are just companies like anything else, and they want to do things that are going to be useful and that people actually want, and they're going to sort of like make them look good and everyone's going to be happy. Now, if we're saying, yes, we really want this feature, that's a way for the engineers can say, hey, yes, look, we'd like to work on this, and look, the web community are really, really keen to have this. That really worked quite well for things like Grid. I think it could probably work for Subgrid as well. And any other feature that you're really keen on, make sure that engineers know and that browsers know that we do want that and we have use cases for it. Other ways you can do that. Write about the stuff you want to see. Write about it in your blog, tweet about it, share things that you see about it so that, again, it sends signals. quite often, when I'm in a CSS working group meeting, people say, does anyone actually care about this? And we're just searching. We're just searching to see, have people been writing about it? You know, is it out there as something that people are interested in doing? Again, use new features. If you can use them with a fallback, use them, because it adds to the weight of people who are using that feature. So if it's implemented in browser A but not in browser B does not want to be the one who looks worse when someone comes and that feature's being used. So here's one of the sites. This is the Chrome status site. Browsers have the information about how much CSS properties and anything else is being used in the wild. So they know if people are using properties that they don't support. And if they know enough people using properties, then they're more likely to want to implement them. And hopefully before long, you know, we should see, certainly in Firefox Nightly, we should see an implementation of Subgrid. It'll probably appear behind a flag, as these things do. That's how we do experimental features these days. So please, you know, try it out. I've already put a whole bunch of examples out there in the wild, which are linked from my resources for this talk. So you can just go and have a look at my examples, maybe change a few things, see how it works, see if it would solve your use cases. And then, you know, let us know about it. And you can let the CSS working group know this stuff. All of our issues are on GitHub. You can raise your own issues if you want, or you can comment on issues that are there. Or you can tell someone like me and I'll go and raise an issue. It's an interesting sort of world. It's obviously a very nerdy world for people who really like CSS and work on CSS. It can sometimes seem like we're all having big arguments, but they're sort of on the academic side of arguing rather than the we're already cross with each other side of arguing. We honestly all get on very, very well. But if you do post something and then people start to sort of like discuss it in strange terms, it's not a reflection on you. As I often say, you know, it takes a CSS working group to make CSS. You know, there's not one CSS overlord. And so, you know, things are discussed and things tend not to end up being shipped in exactly the way the person who suggested it thought that it would work. Because we've got to make sure this works for everyone. But really, I would love to see more people participating in the web platform. And you can do that as simply as writing and talking about this stuff by starring bugs, by, you know, finding the things that are just being implemented and trying them out in a nightly version of a browser and reporting things. I've been given an awful lot by the web platform. You know, I've given an awful lot of my free time to the platform, but by contributing, you know, I've had an amazing career really of being able to dig into this stuff and work with people who are just incredibly clever and know so much about these things, which for someone who left school at 16 to go and be a dancer, this is not the career that I expected to have, and an awful lot of that has been literally through contributing, and then because of that contribution, kind of being able to then work with these people who know so much more than I do. And I really would love more people to get involved with that world because it really has been fantastic. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed today, and it's been really great to be here. Thank you.
Wow, another amazing talk. That was brilliant. You are so clever.
Yeah.
Could we have some questions
Any
then?
questions? Everyone's just like, want to go to the pub now.
So with Subgrid for display, for grid template rows and template columns, if you're using the same, is there any discussion at the moment to sort of join the two, so you only have to say once that you want to use Subgrid?
I'm not sure if it's part of the shorthand actually. I'd have to look. I have a feeling it's not, but I'm not sure. It may be. That shorthand is awful, so I never use it.
Do you envisage a time when there's a visual editor for Grid?
I mean, there already are a few people doing that sort of thing. My concern with visual editors for Grid is that it would be super easy to disconnect the visual view from the source order. Because I kind of touched on it, but if you position things out of order on your grid, it's the same as if you use the order property in Flexbox or just row reverse. The order in which you tab through things and the order in which things are read out by a screen reader follows the source. It doesn't follow the visual view. The problem with that is that you can completely disconnect the two. And if someone is, particularly if they're keyboard navigating, or they're cited but you having it read out to them for whatever reason, it could be very, very confusing. I think that is something that eventually will probably get solved in a, to be able to say as a web developer, use the visual view, not the source view. But I think that is going to be the biggest challenge for any visual editors, and people are already starting to do that sort of thing, is that it would make it incredibly easy for you to just jumble things up. So that's kind of the concern with that kind of stuff. But I'm sure there will be masses of them, because it's almost back to the days of Dreamweaver and the kind of table layouts, which I got involved with the Web Standards Project to work on Dreamweaver when it was Macrometeors. So I can totally see that happening, but that's kind of the concern with that, is the accessibility piece.
Any more questions? No. Just wanted to say, well, first of all, thank you very much for coming, and I'll let these guys wrap up. But the speeches, everything that you've seen, is going to be made available. The presentations, if you keep an eye out on the website for Colchester Digital, Dean will explain where all the presentations are.